I signed my wife's family's prenup when I was broke. After she cheated, they demanded, tear up that prenup now. She deserves half your fortune for putting up with you all these years. They added, you should be grateful. She even stayed with someone so beneath her standards. Now they're demanding I give her everything. So I took my revenge. Hey everyone. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Sup, Reddit. So this is going to be a long one, but I need to get this shit off my chest somewhere. Just finalized my divorce last month, and holy hell, what a journey. So rewind to about 10 years ago. I'm 29, working construction as a junior project manager, pulling down maybe $48,000 a year. Not exactly living the dream, you know? Had about $75,000 in student loans from an engineering degree that I barely used because the job market sucked when I graduated. Then I met Sierra. Dude, this chick was seriously out of my league, like, not even the same sport. She's 27, blonde, always dressed like she just stepped out of some magazine. Had this way of carrying herself that screamed, I've never worried about money a day in my life. She was working part-time as a dental hygienist, which seemed normal enough. What I didn't know then, and didn't find out until we'd been dating for like 3 months, was that Sierra came from serious money. I'm talking about Johnson Auto Group money. Her parents, Frank and Linda, own 3 car dealerships across our county. Here's the thing though. I had inherited my grandfather's business when I was 26, but it wasn't exactly something to brag about. Earl's Metal Works was this tiny fabrication shop that made random metal parts for local companies. Picture the most stereotypical old machine shop you can imagine. That was it. Ancient equipment, office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, computer that probably still ran Windows 95. Between my construction job and trying to keep the shop from going under, I was basically living paycheck to paycheck. Sierra was cool about it initially. She'd swing by the shop sometimes and chat with the old-timers. We dated for about 2 years before the marriage conversation started getting serious. That's when the Johnson family money situation got complicated. Frank pulled me aside one day when I was at their house. Just him and me in his office that overlooked the main dealership lot. Austin, I like you, son. You're a stand-up guy and you make Sierra happy. But I gotta be straight with you here. Sierra's used to a certain lifestyle. I built this business so my family wouldn't have to stress about money the way I did growing up. I totally got where he was coming from. Sierra grew up in that mansion, went to private school, had her own credit card since she was 16. Meanwhile, I was splitting grocery bills with roommates, and buying generic cereal cause name brand was too expensive. Look, I'm not trying to be a dick about this, Frank continued, but I've seen other wealthy families get screwed over by bad marriages. Good people, but when there's a financial mismatch this big, it can poison everything. That's when Sierra came to me with what she called the solution. Her family's lawyer had drafted up these legal papers that would give her 50% ownership rights to any business I owned. She presented it like we were becoming true partners in everything. Babe, if we're going to be partners in life, we should be partners in business too, right? Besides, if that metal shop is really as worthless as you always say, then this just protects both of us. It's like insurance. I remember sitting in my crappy apartment reading through these documents. Sierra had gotten her own lawyer to review everything, so it all seemed legit. And honestly, I thought Earl's Metal Works was basically worthless anyway. Maybe worth $100,000 if you liquidated all the old equipment and sold the building. So giving her half of essentially nothing didn't seem like a big deal. But the pressure was intense, man. Wedding plans were already in motion. Sierra's family was footing most of the bill, and I felt like if I didn't sign these papers, I'd be starting my marriage by pissing off everyone who mattered to my future wife. Plus, Sierra made it pretty clear this wasn't really negotiable if I wanted her family's blessing and support. So I signed them. At the time, it seemed like the reasonable thing to do. Sierra was happy. Her parents were relieved. Looking back now, I realize that was the biggest mistake of my entire life. But you know what they say about hindsight being 20/20? Sometimes you don't see the trap until it's already closed around your ankle. And that's exactly what happened to me. So after the wedding, life was actually pretty solid for the first couple years. The metal shop was exactly the pain I expected it to be. The customers were really weird. We'd get these random orders for super specific parts that seemed way more complicated than what we were charging for. We'd charge them maybe $800 for something that probably should have cost $2,000, but they never complained about the price. What was really strange was that these same companies kept coming back. Same exact specs, Same rush timeline, same everything. Every few months like clockwork. I kept thinking, why don't these people just find a bigger shop that could pump these out faster and cheaper? Made no sense to me. But around year 3 of marriage, I started getting these really bizarre phone calls at the shop. Companies asking about license renewals and talking about serious money, like hundreds of thousands in quarterly payments. Boeing called. Lockheed Martin called. Defense contractors I'd never heard of. I had no clue what they were talking about. Every call mentioned Earl's technical solutions, which meant nothing to me. I asked the old guys about it, but they just said Earl handled the business side and kept his mouth shut about everything. Your grandfather was a smart man, Austin. Way smarter than he let on. But he kept his cards close to his chest, you know. Old school like that. Meanwhile, Sierra was getting more frustrated with our financial situation. All her friends were buying houses, taking fancy vacations, starting families. We were still renting, driving my beat-up Civic and whatever hand-me-down car her dad let her borrow from the lot. The metal shop wasn't contributing anything positive to our lives as far as she could see. Just this constant drain on our finances and my time. Babe, maybe it's time to seriously think about selling that place. We could use the money for a down payment on a house. My dad knows some investors who flip commercial properties. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Those old guys had worked there their whole careers, and it felt wrong to just sell out from under them. Plus, something about those phone calls was really bugging me. Why were all these major aerospace companies calling about Earl's Metalworks if we were just some tiny fabrication shop in the middle of nowhere? I finally decided I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. Took a week off from construction and went through Earl's office. Found a box of legal documents buried in the back. Patent applications, licensing agreements with major companies, financial statements showing hundreds of thousands in revenue. That's when it hit me. Earl wasn't just some metal worker. He developed specialized processes for aerospace stuff, patented everything, and had been licensing it to major corporations for decades. The fabrication shop was just the cover. The real money was in the patents. And I'd been sitting on this gold mine for 3 years without knowing it. So once I figured out what Earl had actually left me, I called his lawyer, Bill Henderson. Austin, I was wondering when you'd piece it together. Earl told me to let you discover it yourself when you were ready. Said if you were smart enough to run the business, you'd eventually dig through his files. Bill walked me through the whole situation. And holy shit was it bigger than I thought. Earl had been collecting about $400,000 annually in licensing fees when he died. But with new military contracts coming online, Bill estimated we were looking at potentially $2 to $3 million per year. The money started rolling in almost immediately. First quarter after I took control, Earl's Technical Solutions collected $750,000 in licensing fees. By the end of that year, we hit $1.8 million. These weren't new deals either. Companies had been waiting to renew their contracts and expand their licensing agreements. This is where I probably messed up big time. Instead of being honest about the patent situation, I kept it vague. Told Sierra the shop was doing really well and landing some big contracts. Part of me was worried about how she'd react if she knew we were suddenly millionaires. Would she quit her job immediately? Would she expect us to start living like her parents? Would her family start treating me differently if they knew I had more money than them? But honestly, I was also enjoying having this secret success that was completely mine. For the first time in our marriage, I had something that Sierra's family couldn't look down on or worry about. Frank started asking me for business advice. Linda made comments about how I'd really turned that little shop around. It felt good to finally have their respect. Sierra was happy about our improved finances, but she definitely knew something was up. She'd see the bank statements, notice we were spending way more than my construction salary, plus her part-time dental work could possibly support. She started making comments about me keeping secrets and not being transparent about the business. Austin, I'm not stupid. That metal shop doesn't generate the kind of money we're spending. Are you sure everything's legal? I don't want us getting in trouble with the IRS or something. I should have just told her the truth then and there, but I was still learning about patent law and licensing agreements myself. Bill Henderson was great, but he was getting old, and I needed to understand this business inside and out. Plus, I was worried about Sierra's reaction. She'd grown up with money, but this was different. This was generational wealth level stuff. Year 6 was when things really exploded. I was officially rich as hell, but still showing up to construction sites every day pretending to care about building permits and concrete delivery schedules. Sierra's suspicions were getting harder to manage, though. She'd see checks coming in, notice business calls at weird hours, catch me on the phone with lawyers and patent attorneys. She started spending more time with her friends, going out more often, being secretive about her own activities. But she'd come home with shopping bags from expensive stores, talking about restaurants I knew her dental hygienist friends couldn't afford. Something was definitely changing about Sierra, but I was so focused on learning the patent business that I didn't pay enough attention. The other thing that was weird was how Sierra started talking about money. She went from being careful with spending to acting like we had unlimited funds. New clothes every week, expensive spa treatments, talking about redecorating our house that we'd just bought. Austin, we're finally doing well financially. Why can't I enjoy it? You've been telling me for years that the business was struggling. And now suddenly we have money, but you want me to live like we're still broke? She had a point, but something felt off. Sierra had always been smart about finances, even when her family was covering everything. Now she was spending like someone who'd never had to think about where money actually came from. Looking back, I think this was when Sierra started to resent me for keeping the business details secret. She knew we were making serious money, but she felt shut out of the decision-making process. And instead of addressing that directly, she started finding other ways to feel important and included. That's when she started getting involved in all these investment groups and financial planning seminars with her new circle of friends. Friends I'd never met and events I was never invited to. Sierra had quit the dental office completely and was basically living the stay-at-home wife life. At first, she seemed happy about it. No more getting up early to clean people's teeth. No more dealing with asshole patients who blamed her for their cavities. She spent her mornings at the gym, afternoons shopping or meeting friends for lunch, evenings planning elaborate dinners that honestly were way better than anything I could make. For a while, it felt like we were finally living the life she'd grown up expecting. And that's when she met Dean. Apparently, she met this guy at her cousin's wedding. Dean worked for some investment firm downtown, drove a BMW, always wore these expensive suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sierra brought him up constantly after that wedding, always talking about the brilliant financial advice he'd given her. Dean says we should be looking at commercial real estate investments. He thinks we're missing out on major opportunities by keeping everything in basic savings accounts. Dean thinks we should incorporate the business for better tax advantages. I started getting really annoyed hearing about Dean's opinions on everything, especially our finances. Who was this random dude, and why was my wife discussing our business with him? But whenever I brought it up, Sierra would act like I was being paranoid and controlling. He's just a friend who understands investments, Austin. You're always saying you don't know much about the financial planning side of things. Dean's helping me learn so I can contribute more to our decisions. The problem was, I didn't need Dean's advice. Bill Henderson had already connected me with a whole team of professionals, accountants who specialized in patent licensing, investment advisors who understood intellectual property income, tax specialists who could navigate the legal structure Earl had set up. But Sierra didn't know about any of that because I was still keeping the full scope of the patent business secret. Month by month, Sierra was spending more time learning about investments and less time at home. She'd go to these networking dinners that somehow always included Dean. She started dressing differently too, more professional, more expensive, like she was trying to fit into some new social circle that I wasn't part of. I was working longer hours myself, so initially I didn't think much about her new schedule. But Sierra's behavior was getting harder to ignore. She was super secretive about her phone, always stepping outside to take calls. She'd make plans without telling me, then act surprised when I asked where she was going. I mentioned the investment club meeting tonight at dinner yesterday. You never listen when I talk about my activities. Except she hadn't mentioned it. I would have remembered because I was supposed to be home for dinner and ended up eating leftover pizza by myself. The breaking point came in year 8. Sierra announced that she wanted to throw this dinner party at our house for her investment group. Nothing too crazy, just 15 to 20 people so I could finally meet everyone she'd been working with and learning from. Dean's been telling everyone about your success with the metal fabrication business. They're all really interested in hearing your entrepreneurial story and maybe learning from your experience. That made me uncomfortable as hell. I couldn't exactly tell a room full of strangers about aerospace patents and military licensing deals. The whole operation depended on keeping a low profile, and most of the contracts had confidentiality clauses anyway. Sierra, I don't really want to discuss business details with your friends. The metal shop stuff is pretty technical and honestly kind of boring. Austin, these are successful business people. They understand technical details and complex industries. Dean thinks you're being too modest about your accomplishments, and it's hurting your networking opportunities. There it was again. Dean thinks this. Dean says that. I was getting real tired of this guy having opinions about my life and my business decisions. The dinner party was awkward as hell. I spent the whole night giving vague answers and trying to steer conversations toward literally anything else. Dean was exactly what I expected, but what really bothered me was how he interacted with Sierra. Too familiar, too comfortable, like they'd spent way more time together than just some casual networking events. Sierra was different around him too, laughing at everything he said, touching his arm when she talked, acting like this version of herself that I'd never seen before. It was like watching my wife flirt with another guy right in front of me, but subtle enough that I couldn't call it out without looking like a jealous jerk. After everyone left, Sierra was pissed at me for not being more social and engaging with her new friends. Austin, you embarrassed me tonight. These people were genuinely interested in your business success, and you acted like you didn't want to talk to them. Dean even offered to introduce you to some potential investors. Sierra, I don't owe your friends detailed explanations about my business operations. And why does Dean need to know so much about our personal finances anyway? Dean's a professional who's offering free advice and networking opportunities. He's not some random guy. He's helping me understand investment strategies so we can make smarter decisions together. That night, I made a decision. I needed to figure out exactly what kind of investment advice Dean was giving my wife, and why she was suddenly so interested in learning from him instead of talking to me about our financial planning. Something was definitely going on, and I had a feeling it wasn't just about portfolio diversification. So I did what any guy would do when his wife starts acting shady as hell. I hired a private investigator. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but Sierra's behavior had gotten too weird to ignore, and this whole Dean situation was setting off every red flag I had. I told the PI I suspected my wife was having an affair and needed solid evidence for potential divorce proceedings. He didn't judge, just asked for details and got to work. Austin, I gotta ask, you sure you want to know what I find? Sometimes ignorance really is bliss, especially when there's serious money involved. I was sure. If Sierra was cheating, I needed to know before making any major financial decisions. The patent licensing business was exploding, and I was looking at potentially 8 to 10 million annually within the next few years. If she was planning to divorce me and claim half of everything, I needed to protect myself. The PI had answers within 2 weeks, and they were worse than I expected. Photos, audio recordings, financial records, the whole damn package. Sierra and Dean had been having a full-blown affair for almost 8 months. Hotel rooms during investment seminars, weekend trips disguised as financial planning retreats, romantic dinners while I thought she was at book club. But here's the part that really got me. Dean thought he was dating a future multimillionaire. The recordings were brutal to listen to. Sierra talking about how the metal fabrication business was worth millions, how she was married to this successful entrepreneur who was too modest about his accomplishments. Dean eating it all up, making plans for their future together once Sierra divorced her blue-collar husband who doesn't appreciate what he has. The business partnership papers only cover his original assets, Sierra told Dean during one recorded conversation. But everything he's built during our marriage, I'm entitled to half of. We're talking about serious money here, enough for both of us to retire young and travel the world. The irony was perfect. Dean wasn't who Sierra thought he was either. PI said a background check revealed that Dean was basically a mid-level sales guy at a struggling regional investment firm. The BMW was leased, the expensive suits were probably maxing out his credit cards, and he was living in a rented condo that he split with a roommate. Dean was projecting success just as much as Sierra was, and they were both planning to live off money that Dean thought Sierra was going to get from divorcing me. Two frauds planning to screw over someone they both underestimated. Beautiful. The whole thing was pathetic and infuriating at the same time. My wife was cheating on me with some wannabe finance bro who was only interested in her because he thought she was about to inherit millions. And Dean was pretending to be successful to impress a woman who was planning to steal half of my aerospace patent empire that she didn't even know existed. I spent about 2 weeks figuring out my next move. Part of me wanted to confront Sierra immediately and throw all the evidence in her face, but my PI advised me to be strategic about it. Bill Henderson confirmed exactly what I'd hoped. Sierra's 50% ownership rights only applied to Earl's Metalworks, the actual fabrication shop. Earl's Technical Solutions LLC was a completely separate entity that owned the patents and licensing agreements. The paperwork Sierra had signed years ago gave her rights to machinery, buildings, and manufacturing contracts. She had zero legal claim to the intellectual property that was generating millions annually. That's when I realized how perfectly this whole situation was going to play out. Sierra was planning to screw me over using legal documents she thought gave her rights to millions. but she was actually going to screw herself. The business she thought was worth a fortune, Earl's Metalworks, was still basically worthless. Some old machines, a building that needed repairs, and manufacturing contracts worth maybe $800,000 annually. Total value maybe $200,000 if you liquidated everything. Meanwhile, Earl's Technical Solutions was bringing in $4+ million annually and growing faster every quarter. Sierra had no legal claim to any of it. I decided to let Sierra make the first move. My PI kept monitoring the affair while I quietly moved assets around and made sure all the corporate paperwork was bulletproof. If Sierra wanted a divorce, she was going to get exactly what she'd legally contracted for, half of basically nothing. The confrontation came about 3 months later. Finally, she sat me down for what she called a serious conversation about our future. Austin, I think we need to talk honestly about our marriage. We've grown apart over the years, we want different things out of life, and I don't think we're making each other happy anymore. I let her talk. She gave me this whole mature, reasonable speech about how people change, how sometimes relationships run their course, how we'd married young and maybe rushed into things. I think we should consider a trial separation, Sierra continued. Maybe take some time apart to figure out what we both really want out of life. Are you asking for a divorce, Sierra? I'm asking for space to think things through. But honestly, yes, I think divorce might be the healthiest option for both of us. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. Austin, I know this is hard to discuss, but we need to address the business assets. I know you've built something really successful with the metal fabrication operation, and I want to make sure we handle the financial side fairly. What exactly do you mean by fairly? Well, we signed those partnership papers years ago, making me a 50% owner in the business. I think the right thing to do is honor that agreement and split everything down the middle. I acted confused and asked her to explain what she meant. Sierra laid out her whole plan. Sell the metal shop operation, split the proceeds, divide up our other assets according to California community property law. She estimated the total value at several $1,000,000 and seemed confident that I'd agree to her terms to avoid a messy court battle. Sierra, those papers you're talking about give you 50% of Earl's Metalworks, the fabrication shop. Are you sure that's what you want? Austin, don't play games with me. I know the metal shop is generating millions in revenue. Dean helped me research the aerospace manufacturing industry, and companies like yours are worth way more than you've been letting on. There it was. She'd just admitted to discussing our private business with Dean and researching my operations behind my back. But she still had no idea what Earl's Metalworks actually was, versus what was generating the real money. Okay, Sierra, if that's what you want, we can definitely split up Earl's Metalworks 50-50. You absolutely sure you don't want to think about this more? She was sure. Sierra was so confident that she was about to become a multimillionaire that she filed for divorce the following week. Game on. The initial paperwork they filed was absolutely hilarious. They were demanding 50% of all business assets and intellectual property, plus long-term spousal support, plus a bunch of other shit that showed they had zero understanding of how Earl's companies were actually structured. Sierra's lawyer was clearly operating under the assumption that Earl's Metalworks was some kind of defense contractor gold mine worth tens of millions. I could picture Frank and Linda sitting in strategy meetings, talking about how they'd always known I was hiding the true scope of my success. My legal team was locked and loaded for this fight. We had every document going back to the 1970s, every patent filing, every corporate registration, every licensing agreement. Our case was bulletproof. The discovery process was absolutely beautiful to watch. Sierra's team kept demanding financial records for the Aerospace Manufacturing Corporation and getting confused as hell when we handed over the books for Earl's Metalworks, a small fabrication shop with 12 employees making about $800,000 annually in revenue. I heard through the grapevine that Frank was getting frustrated with the delays, probably wondering why it was taking so long to get his daughter her rightful share of my millions. Where are the defense contracts? Sierra's lawyer kept asking during depositions. What defense contracts? My attorney would respond. Earl's Metalworks is a small fabrication shop. They make custom metal parts for local industrial customers. But the millions in revenue, the aerospace connections, the government contracts? You're thinking of a different company. It took Sierra's legal team almost 3 months to figure out that Earl's Technical Solutions even existed as a separate entity. When they finally discovered it and demanded those financial records, my lawyers dropped the nuclear option. Earl's Technical Solutions LLC is a completely separate corporate entity that Mr. Austin inherited independently. Mrs. Austin has no ownership interest in that company and no legal claim to its assets or revenue streams. You should have seen Sierra's face during the deposition when this all came out. Her lawyer was frantically shuffling through the partnership papers Sierra had signed years earlier, finally understanding that her 50% ownership rights only applied to the worthless fabrication shop. Frank and Linda were sitting in the back of the room, and I watched Frank's face go white when he realized what had just happened. But the patents, the licensing fees, the aerospace industry revenue, where is all of that held? Earl's Technical Solutions LLC. Separate company, separate ownership structure, separate everything. Sierra lost her shit completely. Started screaming about how I'd hidden assets and committed fraud by not disclosing the full scope of the business operations. Frank jumped up and started yelling too, claiming I'd deliberately deceived their family about my financial situation. Linda was furious, probably realizing they'd just spent a fortune on legal fees to help their daughter claim half of basically nothing. Her lawyer was desperately trying to argue that the two companies were essentially the same operation and should be treated as one entity for divorce purposes. The Johnson family was clearly all in on this strategy, probably convinced that their expensive legal team could somehow overturn decades of corporate law. My legal team absolutely destroyed that argument. We had decades of corporate records proving that Earl's Metalworks and Earl's Technical Solutions had always been completely separate companies with different tax IDs, different bank accounts, different business purposes, different everything. The fabrication shop made metal parts. The patent company licensed intellectual property. Two totally different operations that happened to be started by the same guy. Sierra's lawyer tried every angle he could think of. Argued that I had a fiduciary duty to disclose the patent income during our marriage. Claimed that keeping the businesses separate was a scheme to defraud Sierra of her rightful assets. Even tried to argue that because some of the fabrication shop's work supported the patent licensing, the companies should be considered integrated operations. None of it worked. The judge was crystal clear during the final hearings. Mrs. Austin signed a legal partnership agreement giving her 50% ownership of Earl's Metalworks. The court will absolutely honor that agreement. However, Earl's Technical Solutions is a separate legal entity with a completely different ownership structure, and Mrs. Austin has no legal claim to those assets. Sierra's lawyer made one final desperate attempt, arguing that I should be required to pay massive spousal support based on my income from Earl's Technical Solutions. But even that didn't work, because the partnership papers Sierra had signed included language specifically limiting spousal support to a small amount for a short period. In the end, Sierra got exactly what she'd legally contracted for: 50% ownership of Earl's Metalworks, a small fabrication shop worth maybe $200,000 total if you sold all the equipment and the building. She also got some furniture, her personal belongings, and about 18 months of minimal spousal support that barely covered her car payment. What she didn't get: any claim to Earl's Technical Solutions, which was now generating about $6 million annually in patent licensing fees. No share of my investment accounts that I'd built using that income. No claim to our house, which I'd purchased entirely with licensing revenue. No long-term financial support. Sierra was absolutely devastated. I watched Frank and Linda's faces go from confident expectation to complete shock to anger in about 30 seconds. They'd been so sure their daughter was about to become independently wealthy, and instead she was walking away with half of some old machinery and a building that needed repairs. Frank actually stood up and started arguing with the judge, claiming there had to be some mistake or misunderstanding. "Your Honor, surely this can't be right. The business generates millions in revenue." The judge had to threaten him with contempt to get him to sit down and shut up. Linda looked like she was about to have a stroke. She kept whispering furiously to Sierra's lawyer, probably demanding to know how they'd missed something so fundamental about the corporate structure. You could see the math running through her head. All those legal fees, all that time and energy, all for basically nothing. She'd quit her dental hygienist job years earlier and had no real career to fall back on. Dean disappeared faster than a fart in the wind the minute he realized she wasn't getting the big payday. Turns out he was only interested in her for the money he thought she was going to inherit, just like she was only interested in mine. The final insult came when Sierra tried to sell her 50% share of Earl's Metalworks to get some cash. Turns out nobody wanted to buy half ownership of a small fabrication shop with aging equipment and a handful of old employees. She was stuck with an asset she couldn't monetize and couldn't afford to operate. She ended up moving back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. Frank and Linda were still supportive of Sierra, but you could tell they were pissed about how much money they'd wasted on legal fees for a case that went nowhere. The whole Johnson family had been so convinced they were about to stick it to me and get Sierra set up for life. And instead, they'd blown probably $200,000 on lawyers, just to help their daughter claim half of some old machinery. Frank called me a few weeks after everything was finalized, and he was clearly embarrassed as hell. Not apologetic exactly, but definitely humbled by how badly they'd misread the situation. Austin, I'll be honest, we thought you were hiding assets and trying to screw Sierra over. Turns out we just didn't understand how your grandfather had set things up. Linda was even more bitter about the whole thing. She'd been the one pushing Sierra to fight for what's rightfully hers and encouraging the aggressive legal strategy. Finding out that Sierra had basically been chasing fool's gold for months really stung, especially since they'd been footing the bills. The Johnson family's reputation in their social circle took a hit too. Everyone knew they'd backed Sierra's divorce expecting her to walk away with millions. And when word got out that she'd ended up with basically nothing, it became obvious that the whole family had massively overplayed their hand. Frank mentioned that some of their country club friends had started making comments about their poor business judgment. Sierra went from living in our nice house as the wife of a secretly wealthy businessman to sleeping in her old twin bed, while her parents dealt with the aftermath of supporting her failed money grab. Meanwhile, I kept absolutely everything I'd built. Earl's technical solutions kept growing. We're now licensing patents to companies developing next-generation military aircraft and commercial aviation systems. I've got more money than I know what to do with, and it's all legally protected from any future claims Sierra might try to make. Dean tried to contact me about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. Apparently, he'd figured out that I was the one with the real money and wanted to discuss potential investment opportunities and partnerships. I had my lawyer send him a cease and desist letter that basically told him to get lost permanently. Sierra has reached out a few times over the past year, usually when she needs money for something important, like car repairs or medical bills. Last I heard, she was working part-time at another dental office and still living with her parents at age 37. Dean moved to Phoenix for a new sales job and hasn't contacted her since. The whole experience taught me everything I needed to know about people, money, and marriage. Sierra's family had always been paranoid about protecting their wealth from gold diggers, but they never realized their own daughter had those exact same tendencies. She saw what she thought was easy money and was willing to destroy our marriage to get her hands on it. The beautiful irony is that Sierra's greed was exactly what ended up protecting me. If she'd been faithful and honest, I probably would have shared everything with her eventually. Instead, she tried to trap me with legal documents and ended up trapping herself in the most spectacular way possible. That's what happens when you get too clever for your own good.